This is our second PowerPoint on World War II, and this one's going to be focusing on the home front. What was happening in the United States during World War II while the battles were being fought? The second two PowerPoints in this unit, totaling four altogether, will be focusing on the European and Pacific fronts, respectively. But this one today will be focusing on what was happening at home during the war. There were a number of social issues that took front stage during World War II at home. And of course, there were a number of issues that changed America at home as a result of World War II as well. Probably the most important thing that happened as a result the of FDR's declaration of war against Japan in December of 1941 is that almost overnight, the United States' employment problems disappeared. We'll look at that in the next slide. But of course, one of the most important issues was that you had for the first time, a peacetime draft that had already existed, now accelerated. And by the end of the war, the draft will have pulled in over 12 million men and women into the war directly. Now, this is obviously into the military service. However, in addition, at home, there was money needed to also support the government during the time of war, and this was done through what are called Liberty or Victory Bond drives. Now, essentially, what a Liberty Bond or a Victory loan is essentially you are loaning money to the government with the assumption that at the end of the war, should the United States be victorious, that money would be returned to you with interest. And throughout World War II, there were a number of war bonds. For those who've ever seen the Marvel movie, the original Captain America, the first Avenger, that's what he was doing throughout a lot of when he first puts on his Star Spangled outfit, and that is, they haven't really figured out a use for him yet, but he goes on war bond rallies and advertisements, live performances, asking people to invest money to support the war effort. And if you look at, that is kind of it's a fictional example, but it's actually pretty representative of, just the huge amount of effort that was generated in order to get people either to sign up for the military directly or to support the war at home through Liberty Bonds. The immediate effect that the war had in the economy was that the Depression era unemployment almost vanished overnight. It was absolutely startling. And because of that, it's given a large rise to the theory, I guess you could almost say conspiracy theory, that of course, FDR knew that Japan was going to attack, and was actually in cahoots with various military. It's a popular conspiracy theory. There's no truth to it, but one of the things that did happen as a result of American war production gearing up was that you do have an incredible amount of jobs now being generated where there hadn't been any for almost a decade. We're talking about people who, some people throughout the country who hadn't had consistent employment since the 1920s. And, the jobs that were created were extensive throughout the entire economy of the country. It wasn't just about building the planes and the tanks and the bombs and loading the bullets and sewing together the uniforms. It also affected on a large scale agriculture, because now not only, did the country need food as it normally does, but the soldiers needed it. And so you have this industrialization of farming that occurs as a result of World War II. And so you have this mass production of large scale agriculture throughout the entire country, primarily to, really grow on a large scale food for the huge number of soldiers that were going to need to fight in this conflict. There were also a number of drives that were run throughout local neighborhoods where people conserved everything from steel to glass to rubber to, even bones. If you may have remembered, there were similar kind of involvements by civilians in World War I. One of the interesting things, though, is that you had the creation of what was called the OPA, Office of Price Administration, and it was during World War II that actually a lot of supplies and things were rationed to people. People couldn't buy certain things. I'll give you guys an example. My father was big into model trains. He was born in 1937. During the war, you couldn't buy model trains that were made of plastic or steel because they were all being used for the war. Instead, he had paper trains that he would kind of cobble together. Now, what we're going to be looking at here for the next couple of slides is kind of a reflection on an assignment that you guys are going to have during this unit, which focus on different ethnic and different parts of the different ethnic groups and different parts of the population and how the war affected them. Now, of course, probably one of the most dramatic changes during World War II for obviously one of the largest groups in the United States was for women. Women now had different departments within the military that they could serve directly. You had departments in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. All of these were special units, but they were units nonetheless where women could be involved. And also, by 1945, you had 250,000 women who would join up the Women's Army Corps, Army nurses. Women were accepted into voluntary emergency services, Navy nurses, Marines, the Coast Guard. I mean, you had just this massive inclusion of women in the military as well. Still, traditional women roles, combat roles, were kind of few and far between. They did happen, but they didn't happen on a very large scale. Where we see probably the biggest impact of, and the most recognizable impact of women during World War II, of course, is characterized by the fictional character of Rosie the Riveter. And Rosie the Riveter was really meant to symbolize women's participation in wartime industry. Women were working in the workforce to build everything from tanks to planes to ships to, everything that was needed for the military. And they did it on a massive, massive scale. Now, the unfortunate part about this, though, was when we get to the end of World War II. And this is something that's actually not on your slide, but it's something that I wanted to talk about here. So for those of you who've chosen to listen to the video, you're getting something a little bit extra today. One of the big things that unfortunately happened with women at the end of World War II is when all those soldiers came home, they wanted their jobs back. And traditional America didn't shy away from having men go back into the factories and all of the heavy lifting work and send women right back into the home. And this is actually what unfortunately happened with the majority of women who had worked in all these heavy industry jobs. As soon as the war was over, the vast majority of those jobs were turned over to men. For African Americans, World War II was a coming out. Um, and I wouldn't say a coming out party because it definitely wasn't a party. Um, African Americans, at this time referred to as colored people, fought to be included in military service. You had in many of the branches of the military, Africans were allowed to sign up, but many of them were not in combat. However, throughout the war, African Americans proved themselves as people who were more than capable soldiers, just as capable as any other American. But the interesting thing about African Americans was they were fighting for what was called the double V: victory at home and victory abroad. Victory abroad, of course, against the enemies of the United States during World War II. Victory at home to also kind of use the war as a way of saying, hey, here we are willing to fight for this country. Don't you think we ought to have the same rights as everybody else? At this time, in many parts of the country, African Americans were segregated. And what this meant was in many states, most of them in the southern region of the United States, segregation forced African Americans into a second-class citizenry that denied them their civil rights as fully enfranchised American citizens and denied them even access to public facilities the same as everybody else. But they were separate facilities that they were allowed to go to. And unfortunately, in many parts of the military, you had a separate but equal standing as well. They were allowed to sign up just as everybody else. In many cases, the units they served in weren't commanded by African Americans, they were commanded by whites. And in many units they served in, they weren't allowed to fight in the front lines because they weren't trusted. One very famous story, though, and that is, of course, is the Tuskegee Airmen. If you've ever seen the movie, it's kind of an okay movie, but it's all right to show it, and that is, of course, I believe it's Red Tips or Red Wings, I can't remember, but these are the Tuskegee Airmen, the people who flew out of the Tuskegee Aeronautical Institute, and they proved to be some of the greatest pilots in American history. At home, however, the move was to kind of use World War II as an example to show people the fact that here we are willing to fight for this country, and yet at home we are being denied our civil rights. One of the very early civil rights organizations, the Congress on Racial Equality, organized a number of peaceful sit-ins. Sit-ins, of course, were examples of civil disobedience, where people would simply sit in at places where they weren't allowed simply because they were of a different color. Then, of course, forcing local law enforcement to arrest them. They then could take that case into court and, have a judge determine, or a judge or a jury determine whether or not the case had any merit. Unfortunately, during World War II, the civil rights protesters made very little headway. The focus of the country was very much on the war, and it really didn't have any time or place to deal with African Americans. There were some exceptions to that rule. There were some things that were done towards the end of World War II, especially when it came to African Americans, that were big victories. First of all, one of the first big things was that FDR declared that if you were an industry that was producing for the war, you could not be segregated. In other words, if an African American showed up and wanted to work, you had to give them exactly the same kind of opportunity as everybody else. The other area in which African Americans made some big progress was in the military itself, where towards the end of World War II, President Truman, who came in after Roosevelt died in 1944. Spoiler alert, guys, sorry. President Truman desegregated the military. And from that point on, African Americans could and were allowed and had to be allowed to serve in any capacity. That was either in commissioned positions or non-commissioned positions. In other words, they had to be allowed to be either officers or non-commissioned officers. So there were some successes made, but as far as on the civil rights front at home, there wasn't a great deal that had been achieved. Another group that had a very interesting experience during World War II and actually has continued on from that point, and those are Mexican Americans. Early on in World War II, it was discovered that there was a shortage of people willing to work in the fields, in the farms throughout the United States, who were producing the food not only for Americans themselves, but for those Americans who were fighting abroad. And so what the United States did was they established what was called the Bracero program, or Bracero, literally translated working hands, for 100,000 of Mexicans to be able to safely come across and immigrate into the southwest portion of the United States and work on farms. And this was really kind of the beginning of a much more steady immigration coming into the United States, where you had the farming and agricultural areas needing to be farmed and needed to be tending. And Mexican Americans, of course, just across the border, was an easy source of labor. And so it was at this time that these people were invited into the country. How times have changed. They were invited into the country to work on American farms. Now, for many Mexican Americans, jobs in not only the agricultural sector, but in industry, it provided an escape from the desperate poverty of migratory farm labor. A lot of people moved from just working in the farms to working in heavy industry. A lot of the war industries also took advantage of labor. And one of the areas where this happened was in the southern portion of California, namely in the Los Angeles area. Now, this ended up being a bit of a source of problems, and as you can imagine, this was largely racially motivated. You have a group of people coming in, occupying jobs. Soldiers, normally from any of the branches of the military, saw this and were kind of scratching their heads going, okay, if these guys are here, what's going to happen when this war is over and I need to come back and have a job? And this sparked this conflict between white servicemen and primarily Mexican American kids, especially in the Los Angeles area, sparked what was known as the Zoot Suit riots. And the reason why they were called this was because a new fashion trend amongst young people, young Mexican Americans, were known as Zoot Suits. Of course, these days people dress it in for quinceañeras and as kind of, just as really kind of a dress up is kind of a throwback to that period of time. But this is when this actually happened. The Zoot Suit riots were incredibly racist. Oftentimes the Zoot Suiters, or the Mexican Americans, were the ones who ended up getting arrested, even though they were themselves the ones who had been attacked by people with racist feelings, whether or not, it's because they were actually occupying jobs that they felt were theirs, and, worrying about what would happen when they got home, would those jobs still be around? It was, whether or not that was really the reason. The point of the fact is that it was often white servicemen that started the fights. And you had, off-duty, Navy and Army and Marines coming back and during shore leave, which is basically a little bit of a rest and vacation. They showed up and they saw these, Mexican Americans walking around Los Angeles, and they started to attack them. And especially in downtown Los Angeles, the police department automatically, instead of arresting the white servicemen, they arrested the Mexican Americans, the zoot suiters, as they called them. And if you read some of the reports and newspaper stories around at the time, it's very clear that the racist intentions were there, and the police officers were incredibly racist. As far as, of course it had to be the zoot suiters because of this, really slick and reckless way that they would dress and dance and all this kind of stuff. It's almost like they said, like, they had it coming. And so if you read this, you really see that it really was motivated by a great deal of racism. And so this kind of, this dominated, at least in the Southern California area. This was kind of the experience of a lot of at least young Mexican Americans during World War II. Now, the group that probably experienced the worst situation imaginable were Japanese Americans. Now, as you can imagine, at the end of 1941, we were now at war with the country that these people had immigrated from. And there was I would say, very logical fear that these people were spies, that they weren't loyal to the United States. Now, I say logical, but I don't say it was rational. In fact, it was very much racially motivated. But we look back on it now and we say, shame on you, that was an awful thing. But the people at the time, what else could you feel? And in a video you guys will watch, there's a Japanese American woman she was a college student up in Berkeley, and she looks around, and it was right after the Pearl Harbor attack, and she talks about the fact that she'd never been aware of her ethnicity before, and yet here she was looking around, and she just could feel people looking at her. Why? She was Japanese. And she knew why they were looking at her. People had the same experience during 9/11. People, of course, who were of Arab or Middle Eastern descent knew what would happen after it was discovered that it was Middle Easterners who had organized the attacks on not only the Twin Towers, but Washington, D.C., and ultimately the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania that was actually aiming towards the Capitol in D.C. This was kind of people's reaction. In 1942, FDR issued what was called Executive Order 9066. And essentially what it did was it ordered that all Americans of Japanese descent and heritage would be removed to one of 10 what were called relocation centers in states like California, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Arkansas, basically all over the western portion of the United States, but inland and away from what were considered sensitive military targets. Roosevelt probably knew that this was a terrible thing to do to people. However, he also knew that there would be violence probably shown towards these people if he didn't get them out of the way. And what's horrible about it is that over 2/3 of the people who were moved off to those internment camps were in fact full-blown American citizens. They were second generation or third generation American citizens. In fact, the grandfather of a good friend of mine who is getting married to a friend of my wife's, he knows the story very well, how his grandparents had to go to camp, as they said. And the camps themselves were, this is not, I mean, some people want to get the idea that these were like the concentration camps in Germany and in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. They weren't. They were flimsily built buildings, but the soldiers that ran the camps, they knew it was wrong, but they also knew that, at least on some level, most people agreed that it was probably necessary. And the Japanese that went there, most of them went peacefully, happily. They thought it was their American duty to just do what the government had told them to do, even though they were leaving behind businesses and homes and friends and family. My father, who lives in Santa Monica, they had a next door neighbor family who were Japanese Americans. Now, this family was fortunate because my father's family, along with other neighbors, basically just watched over the house and their belongings until they were able to come back, which they were able to towards the end of the war. When, after a Supreme Court decision determined that the internment camps were unconstitutional, Franklin Delano Roosevelt responded by saying, okay, he rescinded the order, in other words, abolishing it, and the internment camps were closed by the end of 1945. But in the meantime, Japanese Americans were very much, stuck, having to live there, and so it was a difficult time for them. Many Japanese Americans were actually able to get out of the camps by signing up for the army. The man that cut my hair through most of high school was actually the father of my fourth grade teacher in elementary school, and he served in the military. It was how he was able to get out of the internment camps, was to sign up for the army. Over 18,000 Japanese American men were able to get out of the camps because they signed up for the army. Now, they didn't serve in the Pacific; they served in Europe. And you guys will see some information about them in our video that goes with the assignment, looking at these different groups during World War II. Okay, folks. Now again is your time to look over your notes and to write your summary paragraph. Obviously, what we're looking at here are actually changes in all three of these categories, but primarily economic and social changes. Obviously, major changes for groups within the United States, and of course, economic changes thanks to all of the war industry employment that was created. So take a look at that and make sure that you include that with today's notes. And again, if you're still confused about how to do the PDFs, please look up the screencast video to see how to download and fill in and then turn in PDF worksheets.